Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit subscribe and give this video a like. It helps more than you might think. On November 1st, 1998, in New York City, an anonymous call led the police to an apartment on Broadway. Inside, they found a gruesome scene. A man lying lifeless in a pool of blood, a knife buried deep in his chest. He was later identified as Mr. Brian Jones. It was soon revealed that he shared the apartment with his wife, but she was nowhere to be found. Surprisingly, even the neighbor, who was often seen nearby, was missing. All attempts to reach either woman led to dead ends, as though they had vanished without a trace. The horrific discovery sent shockwaves through the community, prompting an immediate investigation. After the autopsy, it was reported that Mr. Jones had suffered 32 stab wounds. The sheer brutality of the crime shocked the authorities, leading to a full-scale search for the two missing women. A week later, the police received word of a woman found near a stream. She was identified as Mr. Jones' wife and was brought in for questioning. Her testimony painted a chilling picture of what had happened. As she began to speak, her voice trembled. "I tried to stop it," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I wish I had tried harder." The room fell silent, every gaze fixed on her shaking hands. Brian and I had been married just a few months. The thought of starting a family had begun to blossom in our hearts, and we were searching for a home where our children could grow. Days spent scouring the city had been frustrating. We had seen countless apartments, but none met our expectations. Some were too small, others were run down. A few seemed promising, but unreasonable landlords or high rent made them out of reach. Just when we were about to lose hope, we found an apartment on Broadway. It wasn't in a neighborhood I was familiar with, but my husband had grown up just a few streets away. He seemed at ease, pointing out places he remembered from his childhood as we drove. For me, though, it was all new. Still, it felt perfect. The high ceilings, large windows, and spacious layout made me feel at home the moment we walked through the door. This was the place where I thought our dreams would begin. But dreams can turn into nightmares. On June 23rd, we finally moved in. With only a few boxes and a suitcase, the move was easy. Just as we got off the truck that had brought us there, I noticed another building across the street. It was closer than I had initially realized, almost too close. As I carried in the last of our belongings, I glanced across the way. The curtains in one of the windows twitched. I paused, staring at the window, but couldn't see anyone. It was dark, and the curtain was still. I could have sworn someone was watching us. Once inside, I told my husband about what had happened, and he assured me it was probably just the wind. I knew he was trying to calm me down, but I felt certain someone was observing us. He sighed and suggested it was probably Mrs. Dalton, the woman who lived in the apartment. She had recently lost her husband and was probably lonely and a bit odd. I hadn't considered that. At first, my unease faded as I felt empathy for Mrs. Dalton. Losing someone you love was devastating. "You're right. Maybe she's just lonely. We should be kind to her." I nodded, feeling more at ease. Brian agreed. The next day, in an attempt to be friendly, I baked a simple apple pie. We took it over to Mrs. Dalton's house. After a moment, she came outside and invited us in. As we stepped inside, I noticed a framed photo on the mantel of Mrs. Dalton and her late husband, a handsome man with a warm smile. It was clear she still mourned his loss. "I made this for you," I said, handing her the pie. Her eyes widened in surprise. "You shouldn't have," she murmured, taking the pie. "I'm the one who should be bringing you a welcome gift." We talked for a while, though I couldn't really tell how long. As the conversation went on, I began to notice something. Mrs. Dalton's gaze lingered on Brian, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned closer, her hand brushing against his arm with an unsettling familiarity. My cheeks flushed with anger. Was she flirting with my husband? I tried to ignore my growing discomfort, but it became harder with each passing moment. I forced myself to rejoin the conversation, though my words felt stiff and insincere. I could tell that Brian was enjoying the attention, and that made me feel even more uneasy. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly. "We should probably leave," I said, my eyes fixed on the woman touching my husband. Brian looked surprised. "But we just got here," he protested. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I think we've stayed long enough." I had never felt so jealous and insecure. I knew I was being irrational, but I couldn't help it. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about Mrs. Dalton and her strange behavior. I knew I had to talk to my husband about it, but I was afraid of what he might say. I didn't want to seem paranoid or insecure. "I'm sorry about earlier," I said, breaking the silence. "I think I might have overreacted." He smiled. "Don't worry about it, honey. You're just protective." But I knew it was more than just that. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. It was only the beginning. A few days passed, and with each passing day, my unease grew. Every time I stepped outside, I had the feeling that someone was watching my every move. One afternoon, I was inside when I began to hear voices. I rushed to the window and peered out. There was Brian, deep in conversation with the neighbor. They were standing so close, their bodies almost touching. Her hand was resting on his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the image was enough to understand what was going on. As I watched, Brian followed the neighbor into her house. Panic surged through me, and I rushed outside, pounding on Mrs. Dalton's door with increasing urgency. After a few moments, the door swung open, and my husband emerged, holding a pair of garden shears in his hand. "What's going on?" he asked, confusion written on his face. "Why were you in there?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of frustration and fear. "What were you doing?" "She asked me to help her with her garden," he replied, his tone dismissive. "And why were you touching his face?" I pressed. Brian sighed, his patience wearing thin. "She was just being friendly. You're getting paranoid, Brittany." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "I'm not paranoid," I insisted, my voice rising. "I saw you. You were too close to her." "We were just talking," he repeated, his voice flat. "You wanted me to be friendly with her, remember? Now stop making a scene." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, seething. I couldn't believe this was happening. I had trusted him, but now I was starting to doubt everything. As the days went by, my suspicions grew stronger. My husband's behavior started to change. He spent more time away from home, often making excuses to leave. He seemed distant, distracted, his mind always somewhere else. I was terrified I was losing him, that he was falling for Mrs. Dalton. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. That evening, I called out to Brian that dinner was ready, but he replied that Mrs. Dalton was coming over. She was bringing something with her. I was surprised. He hadn't mentioned anything about the neighbor coming over. I tried to hide my confusion, forcing a smile as I set the table. When she arrived, she brought a hearty stew. We ate together, but the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the night wore on, I began to feel drowsy. My eyelids grew heavy, and I excused myself, retreating to bed. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache. My mouth was dry and my body ached as though I had been up all night. I hadn't drunk any alcohol, so I couldn't understand what was causing the discomfort. The house was a mess, as if a party had taken place. Empty glasses and plates scattered around. But my husband wasn't home. I rushed to Mrs. Dalton's house, knocking frantically on the door. It creaked open, and I stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. She wasn't there. Panic started to settle in as I began searching the house, trying to make sense of what was going on. As I entered the dimly lit room, an oppressive sense of unease pressed down on me, thick as the shadows that clung to the walls. The dim, flickering light from a single bulb revealed walls painted in a deep crimson, a color too vibrant, too visceral to be mere decoration. They were adorned with images, dozens of them, pinned in chaotic clusters like a macabre gallery. At first glance, the pictures seemed ordinary, but as I moved closer, the horrific details began to emerge. They were of Brian and me, or at least they should have been. My face had been meticulously replaced with Mrs. Dalton's in every photograph, her features seamlessly inserted where mine should have been. In some pictures, I had been crudely erased, leaving only empty silhouettes beside Brian, or worse, his arm draped around nothingness. One image in particular caught my eye, a close-up of Brian smiling warmly, his hand resting on a shoulder that was undeniably mine. The edges of the photo burned as if to emphasize its importance. A chill ran down my spine and I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a rickety side table. My breath caught in my throat as the room seemed to close in around me. Was this some kind of twisted obsession? A sick game? I turned to leave, but as I did, I felt a presence behind me. There she was, standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. I didn't know when she had gotten in. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. I pushed past her, my heart racing. I had to get away, had to find my husband. When I returned home, I found Brian sitting in the living room. I poured out everything, about the sinister room, the haunting pictures, and how she had cornered me. But as I spoke, his expression darkened, disbelief and frustration clouding his face. "You're imagining things," he said flatly, as if I had made it all up. Determined to prove my point, I dragged him back to her house. We knocked on the door, and she greeted us with her usual welcoming smile. As we walked through her house, I pointed out the room where I had seen the disturbing images. She denied everything and led us to the room. To my horror, it was completely ordinary, empty, clean, and devoid of the grotesque images I had witnessed. Brian turned to me, disappointment clouding his face. His eyes flashed with anger. "What's wrong with you?" he snapped. "You're acting crazy." I was stunned. How could he not believe me? I knew what I had seen, but with his doubt, I began to question everything. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Slowly, my suspicions about the neighbor pushed my husband further away. I noticed the way he looked at her. He spent more time with her, often returning home late, smelling of her cooking. I retreated into myself, my world narrowing to the view from the window. Day after day, I watched him and Mrs. Dalton laughing together, their intimacy growing with each passing moment. The final blow came when he announced he would be spending the weekend at her house. He claimed it was for work, but deep down I knew he was lying. He was choosing her over me, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I felt helpless. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I was a prisoner in my own home. One evening, as I watched them from the window, a desperate thought struck me. I couldn't let this continue. I needed proof, something undeniable to show Brian. Days later, as I was cleaning up the bedroom, I stumbled across something hidden behind a pile of books on the nightstand. It was a small, discreet camera, and my stomach dropped as I realized what it was. I turned it on, my hands shaking, and began to watch the footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The recordings showed moments from our life, seemingly captured from various spots in our home. At first, I thought it was just random footage, but then I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. The footage had been filmed from angles only someone with access to our apartment would have known about. Some of the shots were focused on the hallway, others on the bedroom, and even one from inside the living room with the camera positioned perfectly to catch conversations and private moments. It was all too familiar, too precise. I noticed that the angles of the shots were unusual. There were times when I could swear I saw the corner of a window in the background, or the distinct pattern of curtains that were only visible from Mrs. Dalton's apartment across the street. It was as if the camera had been strategically placed to capture us without us noticing. But then I realized something even more unsettling. The footage wasn't just showing us. It revealed that it could only have been Mrs. Dalton, or so it seemed. For example, in one of the videos, I caught a glimpse of a private conversation I had with my partner, and what looked like her reflection was briefly visible in the glass of the window. It was subtle but chilling. Had she been there, silently watching us from afar? The most damning evidence was the final video. I saw her at the edge of the frame, standing by the window across the street, adjusting the camera. The footage clearly showed she had been using her apartment as a vantage point to spy on us. She had been watching us from her own home, secretly filming everything, and somehow she had placed another camera inside our bedroom while we were away, without us ever knowing. It was impossible to deny now. Mrs. Dalton had been the one orchestrating this. She had planted the camera when we weren't home, and from her house had been tracking every moment of our lives. The evidence was clear, and I finally knew the truth. When I showed it to Brian, the truth finally hit him. His face paled as he realized the depth of her intrusion. Together, we resolved to cut all ties with her, avoiding her at all costs. For a time, things seemed to return to normal. The fear and paranoia began to fade, and we tried to rebuild what had been broken. But then one morning, I woke to an empty bed. My husband was gone. Assuming he had left early for work, I carried on with my day. Stepping out for a few errands, I returned home to find wet footprints trailing into the house. My pulse quickened as I followed them, the trail leading to the living room. A noise startled me. I cautiously approached the door and pushed it open. The scene before me froze me in place. Brian lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling around his body. Panic surged through me, and as I turned to flee, a sharp blow struck the back of my head. When I came to, the world around me was unrecognizable. I was lying in a dense forest, with the faint murmur of a stream echoing in the distance. The pain in my head reminded me of the blow that had brought me here. The towering trees were unfamiliar, their looming presence adding to my unease. My clothes were torn, my body bruised and sore, a dull ache spreading through my limbs. The earthy smell of moss and damp leaves filled my nose, grounding me in the moment. I stumbled through the forest, the damp earth sinking beneath my feet with every step. Hours passed before I finally reached a clearing by the stream, its calming presence soothing my rattled nerves. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the soft ground, too exhausted to move any further. Just as I was about to lose consciousness again, I heard footsteps approaching. A group of fishermen emerged from the trees, their rough, weathered faces filled with concern. They spoke to each other in hushed tones before one of them knelt beside me, offering a hand to help me up. "You're safe now," he said gently, guiding me to my feet. They had found me near the water, dazed and battered, and without hesitation, they had carried me through the dense forest and to their camp. From there, they took me to the nearest hospital for treatment. As I lay in the hospital, recovering, the horrifying image of Brian's lifeless body haunted me. How could it have come to this? How could that wicked woman, that manipulative monster, have been so cruel? After Mrs. Brittany Jones recounted her terrifying story, the police launched an investigation. However, Mrs. Dalton seemed to vanish without a trace. Without evidence, the case remained unsolved. Mrs. Jones, traumatized and accused, was detained for several months. Eventually, she was released due to lack of evidence. Many in the neighborhood believed Brittany's story, convinced that Mrs. Dalton was a dangerous woman capable of unimaginable harm. Others, however, doubted her claims, suggesting that she herself might have been involved in her husband's death and Mrs. Dalton's disappearance, a jealous wife unable to bear the thought of another woman in her husband's life. To this day, the truth remains shrouded in mystery. The neighborhood is forever marked by the unanswered question, what really happened to Mrs. Dalton? You've made it, for now. Thank you for joining on this horrifying journey. If you want more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and to follow on other platforms. There are many more stories to come, and if you enjoyed this, please like the video. It really helps. Let me know your favorite part or any suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, if you can.